So two guys met on a golf course in Florida, and they began talking. And the one person asked the other, he said, "How did you happen to come to Florida, by the way?" And the guy said, "Well," he said, "I had a small business in New York, and I built the business from the ground up. I put in long hours, 16-hour days, and everything. And finally it became a going concern, and it was making a lot of money. And then there was a huge fire, and my business was destroyed, and the insurance company gave me a big check," he said, and I looked at the check, and I thought, do I want to put in those 16-hour days to build this business up again, or maybe I should just take this check and retire to Florida? And so that's what I did. He says to the second guy, he says, "How did you happen to come to Florida?" Second guy says, "Pretty much the same story." He said, "I was in Minneapolis." He said, I had a small business that I built from the ground up, put in long hours, hard work, built it into a growing concern, and then there was a flood, and it came, and it wiped out my business." He said, "And the insurance company gave me a huge check, and I looked at it, and I thought, do I want to put in that time again? And I decided to retire and come here to Florida." And the first guy looks at the second guy, and he says, "How do you start a flood?" I probably shouldn't tell you this, but in my official church biography, it says that I authored an article entitled, "Insurance Fires as a Stewardship Tool." Today I want to talk to you about some practical advice on picking a new rector and what you might want to do in this liminal time, the time between rectors. And the first thing I'm going to suggest is that you explode any unexploded ordnance, okay? Landmines, if you will. Everybody has landmines. We all have sensitive issues, right? I mean, have you ever been talking to somebody and you're having a great conversation, and all of a sudden you start talking about something else and their eyes just glaze over? You just hit a sensitive issue, right? I don't know if you've had this experience or not, but you found a great counselor, and this counselor has walked with you through all sorts of issues and been supportive and caring. And then you raise a new issue, and suddenly they're not so supportive and they're not so caring, and you realize, hey, that's what they're wrestling with in their personal life. What I just raised is what they're wrestling with. I've stepped on a number of landmines in my time, okay? I recall one Sunday, did church, and there was nothing remarkable about the service. Finally came to the closing hymn, and we were processing out, and the closing hymn was, "Glorious things of thee are spoken." You know that one, right? Glorious things of thee are spoken. See, that's why I don't sing, okay? That's why I don't sing. And so I got to the back of the church, and I was getting ready to greet people, and I seen my senior warden coming towards me. And she's coming with a very purposeful walk, right? And she does not have a happy look on her face. And I know that this is not going to be a good conversation. And she says to me, "If you ever play that hymn in church again, that's the last you'll see of me. I can still see those blank goose-stepping down the street to that tune." The tune is Austria, German national anthem during World War II. I knew she was Dutch, but what I didn't know at the time is that she and her husband had been in the Dutch underground. They'd fought against the Germans during World War II. And when I say she was in the Dutch underground, I mean, she really did. She told me one time she and her girlfriend were supposed to go, and they were flirting with the German guards at this ammunition dump. And while they were flirting with the guards, her husband and a couple other people were planning charges to blow up the ammunition dump. And eventually, they caught her husband. She escaped, but they caught her husband And for 3 years, he was in a concentration camp, and she didn't know whether he was dead or alive. At the end of the war, she found out that he had died in the camp. We never played that hymn again. Landmines. Let me tell you another story. And churches have landmines too. It's not just people that have landmines. Churches have them. About 20 years ago, I was one of the finalists to be the rector of the Episcopal Church in Astoria, Oregon. I don't know if you've ever been to Astoria, but it's a beautiful, beautiful place. Right at the mouth of the Columbia River, it's just in Oregon, just south of the Washington border. I mean, it's just gorgeous there. It's absolutely green and lush, beautiful town, picturesque town, okay? Matter of fact, when I was there, they were building these huge, huge houses right on the beach. And they were massive. I mean, 4,000, 6,000 square feet. And I asked one of the people in the congregation who was a real estate agent, I asked her, I said, those houses they're building on the beach, what are those things selling for? And she rolled her eyes and she said, some of those are selling for $250,000. I mean, it's just amazing. That's changed in the interim. I have friends that live in Portland right now, and they say that their motto is, come to Portland, California prices, crummy weather, right? But anyway, I was one of the finalists, and it's a beautiful old church, The altar is against the back wall. You know, it's the old style where the priest represents the congregation talking to a transcendent God, where they celebrate the Eucharist with your back to the congregation. It's a lovely group of people, and the whole weekend was going really, really well, and I came to the final interview with the vestry. And in the middle of that interview, I said to them, hey, have you ever thought about pulling that altar out from the wall and have the priest celebrate facing the congregation? I have never seen an interview go in the toilet faster than that one did. I tried to get it back, but it was pretty apparent that in that moment that I was not going to be the next rector of the Episcopal Church in Astoria, Oregon. I had just stepped on a landmine. If you have any of those here, it's far better to detonate them now and not wait for the new rector to step on one of those. Okay. Next thing. Heal any old wounds. Most churches at one time or another have been betrayed by clergy. And when I say betrayed, I mean it in the broadest sense of the term. I don't just mean betraying trust. I mean that they called somebody thinking that they were this person, and it turned out they were that person. They were different than who they thought they were getting. And I know I just talked to a couple of you at coffee hour, and I know that you have been betrayed in the past. And if there's any wounds left over from that, heal them now. You know, that's the best thing you can do for yourself. One of the things I learned as a parent is that the best thing I could do for my children was to get as much healing for myself as I possibly could. Because the more healing I had, the better parent I would be. Don't try to recreate the golden age of the church. Every church has their golden age, right? Remember back when? A golden time, when things seemed to just flow smoothly and everyone seemed to get along with each other. And I don't know when your golden age was. I've talked to some of you and they talk about the past when there was an active Cursillo community here and it felt like everything was just light and that you were moving forward spiritually. And that's wonderful that you had that time. Take the values of that time. Take what happened in that time and build on that. Build on that. But don't try to recreate the golden age. You can't go back. You can't go back. So what I hear about that time is that you were growing spiritually and you felt together spiritually. Maybe you need to think when you call a new rector to find somebody that can lead you to spiritual growth, more spiritual maturity, offer you more. And that's wonderful. By the way, that's wonderful. There's a lot of congregations who are just trying to survive, right? That's their goal. All I want to do is survive. You want to grow. You want to grow spiritually. You want to grow in the Lord. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. Don't assume that your new rector will have the same gifts as your old rector. One of the mistakes churches make is, every clergy has their strengths and their weaknesses, right? I mean, you can have a clergy person who's a great preacher and a great pastor, but they're not very good at administration. And so what congregations tend to do is they tend to say, we're going to find somebody who's really good at administration. And they assume that this person is going to be a great preacher and a great pastor to boot, right? I mean, that's the assumption. It doesn't always work out that way. There's a congregation that shall remain nameless in another diocese. It's located in a college town, right? And there was a lot of politics in this congregation. There were factions and groups, and they were always, fighting, and there was a lot of conflict. And they had a rector that knew how to manage that conflict, that knew how to play the politics and manage things. But he wasn't very intellectual. And this is a college town, and so they got a lot of professors and administrators from the college attending. And so they said to themselves, let's get somebody who's really intellectual, who's a scholar, for our next rector. Because their rector was called to be a bishop. He left to become a bishop somewhere. So they said, let's get somebody who's a scholar, who's really intellectual. And they called this poor guy that had been a college professor, right? And he got to the church, and he was intellectual. But he didn't understand church politics. And it just ate him up. He was gone within a year. He was gone within a year. I mean, it seems hard to believe, right, that you would make that assumption. I was called to be a rector one time. And part of the reason I was called to be a rector is that I look like their prior rector. I'm serious. How do I know that? People called me by his name. They got a Christmas card addressed to me, and when you opened it up, there was a little note, Dear Ellie, who was my wife, and then the rector's name, right? The prior rector's name. And the problem with that is they assumed that I would be exactly like the prior rector because I look like him. And of course I wasn't. And that was a big blow to them. That was a big blow to them. The person that you make sure that the person you call has the same gifts that the person that left you want them to have, right? Don't assume that they're going to have those same gifts. Don't assume that they're going to have those same gifts. And finally, how well your new rector does is at least partly up to you. It's at least partly up to you. Now, interim rectors don't count, okay? See, the assumptions between interim rectors and rectors are entirely different. I mean, I've been both. And one of the things that happens with an interim rector is, it's always a blow to the congregation to find out that their rector has faults and flaws, right? I mean, every time, when they call a new rector, this person, hung the moon, invented sliced bread, can walk on water. And then gradually they start to realize that this person is flesh and blood and human and has faults and flaws like everybody else. And that's a lot of times a big blow. Now, with an interim rector, when they find out the person has faults and flaws, they go, no problem. This person's gone in 18 months. We can just outlast them, you know? I mean, it's a great joy to be an interim rector because they accept you right away, right? But with a rector, they go, oh, we might be stuck with this person for years and years and years. And how you do, how that person does, depends at least in part upon you. How do I know that? Because I've been at both ends of that spiral. I've been in a congregation where the congregation was critical and judgmental. And my response to that was to be angry and defensive, which meant that they got more critical and judgmental, which meant I got more angry and defensive. I mean, it's my fault too, right? My fault too, the way I handled it. But it had a tendency to spiral downwards. On the other hand, I've also been in the upward spiral, where a congregation is affirming and loving, and it frees you up to be more creative, to take more risks, to listen more to the leading of the Spirit. And then they love it, and it frees you up again, and it just spirals upwards. It spirals upwards. So a lot of how your new rector does is up to you. It's up to you. Now, I have to tell you that what I've seen of the people coming out of seminary, what I've seen from some of the young clergy, is that they're fantastic. They are utterly fantastic. They understand things like organizational structure. They understand the spiritual aspects of that, how to translate that into churches. That there's some really wonderful people out there. And given this congregation, given all the pluses that you have here, I am sure that you are going to select someone to be of high quality. Someone of high quality. Finally, the last thing that I want to leave you with is, know that through this whole process, God will be with you, and God loves you. How do I know that? In the course of my life, I have given God hundreds, if not thousands, of reasons to stop loving me. And God never has. God never has. Amen.